But here? Sitting under a simple grate like an open sewer? Maybe some of the alleys in her old Philadelphia neighborhood were that way, but surely not here. "Caretaker," she called. Again, no answer. "Well, She looked down at the brown mass under her feet and changed her mind about the words she'd been planning to say. So the caretaker was lying low. Fine. There was more than one way to pop a clutch. "Wisp," she called instead. "Come here." The wisp glided over, its black eyes and wide slit of a mouth expressionless as always. Nicole took its hand and squeezed the pale, silvery white skin. "What's this brown stuff under the grate?" she thought toward the creature. "It's part of the air system." The answer flowed across her mind. Carbon dioxide and other unusable molecules are absorbed, fragmented, and converted into oxygen and other useful molecules. "Ah," Nicole said aloud, peering down at the brown stuff again. Vaguely she remembered something in one of her grade school classes about plants doing that same job on Earth, eating up the carbon oxide stuff and spitting out oxygen. She'd never fully believed that. For one thing, if it was true, how come she'd never felt more awake in a park than when she did hanging around with Drake's gang? But the book said that was how it worked, and that was what the teacher had marked correct on the test, so she'd more or less accepted it. There'd been something in that same class about why most plant leaves were green, too, but she'd forgotten what. The Fyrantha seemed to get along okay with brown stuff instead of green, so it probably hadn't been important. As long as it worked, things would be just fine. Of course, that was the problem. The elephant in the room, as her grandmother used to say. Because the ship wasn't working right, at least not all of it. That was why the shipmasters had kidnapped a bunch of people from Earth, so that the ship could tell them what was wrong and they could fix it. Of course, once it was fixed... She shook her head firmly. One crisis at a time, as her grandmother also used to say. The Fyrantha had declared Nicole to be its protector, for the most ridiculous reason imaginable. Nicole had tried to fix a plant in the arena, mostly because she'd been bored, and now the ship was looking to her to make sure it was properly put back together. If and when she managed to do that, though, the shipmasters who ran the place had some very nasty ideas on what they were going to do with it. But that was the future. Right now, Nicole's crisis was to figure out her way around the ship she was supposed to be the protector of. It was more of a challenge than she'd expected. The Fyrantha was huge. 2 miles long, as near as she could figure, a solid half-mile wide, and 96 levels deep. In the past 9 days, she'd visited every one of those levels, but with only an hour on each one, she'd barely scratched the surface. One of those nights, as she lay awake feeling her legs throb with fatigue, she'd guessed she'd seen less of the Fyrantha even than she had of Philadelphia. Not to mention that so far she'd stuck exclusively to the right rear fourth of the ship. Q4, caretaker Ushkai had called it once, which she'd later figured out was probably short for Quadrant 4. If she wanted to really know the ship, she would have to take this same tour in Q1, Q2, and Q3. She took a deep breath. One crisis at a time. First, she would get a handle on what was where in Q4. Then she would try to figure out how much work still had to be done back here. After that, she could see about the other quadrants. She frowned, her thoughts suddenly stalling. Throughout her months aboard the Fyrantha, she'd heard lots of background sounds from the ship, hums, drones, and whirs, plus a whole range of different thuds, clunks, and bumps. But the soft thumping sound now coming from the darkness was something new. It was mostly rhythmic, but every few thumps there was a break in the pattern, as if the machine making the noise was occasionally freezing up. It was also getting louder.